Well, I know you're not supposed to choose favorites or anything, but I don't think anyone's terribly surprised to know that the feminist theory is kind of one of my favorites. So I'm going to do my best to keep on track and not geek out too hard. Um, the book points out that the contemporary feminist criticism is a product of the second wave of feminism. But just so we're all on the same page here, here is a way too simplistic version of the progression of American feminism so that we have an idea of what all of this wave nonsense means. Basically, we have the first wave. And the first wave started in the late 18th century, but really it took on its big head of steam near the end of the 19th century. The general aims of the first wave were to have women be seen as citizens. They wanted to be educated. They wanted the work of the home to be valued. They wanted to vote. The big culminating moment of the first wave was the fight for suffrage. So when in 1920 the 19th Amendment was passed and it gave women, asterisk, white women, there's a big long train of other things that had to happen for women of color to be able to vote. But 1920, 19th Amendment happens, there's this right to vote. There was a sort of social pressure that said, hey, you got what you wanted, sweetheart, now go home. Of course, a couple decades later, we found ourselves in the Second World War, and women were being called into the workforce as the men were being shipped off to war. And once the men came back, turns out that not all women were happy to just abandon their jobs and go home. This is part of the impulse that led to the second wave of feminism, which really came to its highest point in the 1960s and 70s. The second wave wanted more than just recognition of domestic work and basic citizenship. Now, women wanted access to jobs and equal pay and legal protections in the workplace, the ability to open their own bank accounts or not be fired for getting pregnant, or access to birth control or bodily autonomy, little things like that. So this is the feminism that most people think of when they think of feminism. Note, this was also the time period that saw the rise of a parallel movement known as womanism. Now, womanism called out the fact that feminism was mostly focused on the needs of white women, and the civil rights movement was mostly focused on the needs of black men, and there wasn't really anyone speaking for black women, so there was womanism. Now, as the 1970s saw a number of landmark laws granting increased access and equity to women, the 1980s spawned a time not so affectionately known as the backlash. If the first wave had their you got what you wanted, go home moment, this was you got what you wanted, and it's also that the feminists can destroy the American family and our very way of life and become witches and eat their children. This led to a big push to reinvest in family values. Now, this time, our pendulum kind of swung back a little bit quicker, and in the 1990s, we're seeing what became known as the third wave. And in the third wave, we started to see a more flexible brand of feminism that welcomed men and housewives and celebrated more inclusivity in feminism. This is the wave that brought us intersectionality, which is a term for the idea that we all have multiple identities, privileges, and oppressions working on us at all times, and we're never just one thing. Now, don't get the idea that the third wave is this perfect ideal. It certainly isn't. There are still plenty of problems, but it did open up in a way that the second really didn't. Now, where are we now is always an interesting question. Are we post-feminist? I kind of doubt it. Has the advent of #MeToo ushered in a fourth wave? Maybe. It's always kind of hard to say where you are in a movement while you're there. So maybe in 20 years we'll have a name for where we are right now. It'll be pithy. It'll be great. Maybe you'll come up with it. Who knows? Anyway, now as our book points out, unlike the other lenses we've looked at where we took philosophical ideas and applied them to text analysis has always been part of the feminist project because the second wave in particular was very interested in the way that women were represented in culture and media. So study of this public representation was always part of the project of feminism. And while much feminist criticism started out deconstructing patriarchal narratives, it didn't take long to shift more fruitfully to the exploration of women's voices and the inclusion of women in the canon of great literature. We call this consciousness raising, trying to get people to recognize that women are here in the first place. Feminist criticism also draws on a lot of other theoretical lenses, so a lot of the things you've already learned are going to be very useful. But a few things that are sort of specific. There was an idea of looking for the female voice, and this is Helene Cixous. We're going to be reading her article. She posits the idea of the écriture féminine, a feminine voice. In her landmark essay that we're reading, The Laugh of the Medusa, she sets the challenge for women to write themselves into history, to not feel bound by the rules of male narrative and writing. So she's not talking just about writing about women. She's talking about writing in ways that are unique to women. Many argue that this view is too essentialist, meaning that it assumes certain essential differences between rational men and emotional women based solely on biological sex. But the challenge to think differently about language and form is sort of the most exciting and important part here. There's Julia Kristeva, who engages in the question of feminine language as well. But she's more talking in this idea of the symbolic and semiotic modes of language and imagery. Basically, she's arguing that the symbolic mode is the seemingly concrete surface realm of meaning, while the semiotic mode allows for the complexity of slippage and even deconstruction of language and the self. Kristeva also gives us the idea of abjection, dealing with the grotesquerie of the female, particularly the mother's body, and the human drive to leave it behind. But that's maybe more than we need right at this juncture. I can go into more if you're interested. Now, as I did mention, feminist criticism uses a lot of other schools, and it seems crazy, based on our conversations about this so far, that feminism could have much use for psychoanalysis since it's so unkind to women. But I love the notion in Barry that a handful of women theorists have been rehabilitating Freud and Lacan, since a lot of their ideas are rich and interesting. So it seems a shame to just cancel them altogether. Kate Millett argues that Freud's ideas point to a social construction of both male and female sexuality, and so his ideas seek to understand the apparatuses that put them in place, rather than looking at them as inherent immutable truths about gender and sexuality. For example, this gives us the idea that penis envy is not literal desire for a penis, but for what the penis represents, a place atop the social hierarchy. When speaking in this more symbolic term, we usually use the term phallus instead of penis envy, just FYI. Another important element that doesn't make it into our text, but is still really central, is the idea of the male gaze. Second wave film critic Laura Mulvey introduced this idea to refer to the way in which Western narratives are constructed to center the experience of the male protagonist, as well as the male viewer. The man acts, the woman is acted upon. The man pursues, the woman is pursued. And we train all audiences, not just men, to look at stories this way, with the man as the active participant and the woman as the passive object of desire. So that's sort of how we look at the structure of narrative through this idea of the male gaze and how we've taught society to look at women as objects and men as active. So what does feminist theory do? What does a feminist theorist do? One of the things they're trying to do, first and foremost, is they're trying to rethink the canon. We have these lists of all these important works that we think you have to know. And unsurprisingly, most of them are by dead white men. So feminist theorists try to point out that there are important works written by people who aren't dead white men. And while they're revisiting this canon, they're also trying to revalue women's experiences, assuming that women's stories are worth telling and women's voices are worth hearing. They also examine and question representation. They look at representations of women in literature by both men and women. How do different authors draw women? What does that portrait look like? They challenge representations of women as other, or as lacking, or as essentialist, part of nature. Simone de Beauvoir points out that men are the default definition of human, where women are always defined in their relationship to men. They're not being manness, right? They lack being a man. And on a different but similarly existentialist note, women are often painted as inherently connected to nature and nurturing, which sounds kind of nice, but it's pretty limiting, right? So they're pushing back against these representations that feel too passive or limiting. They're also going to examine power relationships in texts. How are systems of power drawn, supported, or subverted in the text? Who has power? What does having power look like? What keeps people who don't have power from reaching it? How is gender or sex connected to structures of power? We'll see questions like this come up again in post-colonial theory, in particular, in critical race theory, in queer theory. The questions of power come up a lot in theory. We also explore the construction of gender. We recognize the role of language in constructing gender and in hiding the construction of those systems of power and oppression. Because language doesn't just make it, right? Language tries to make it look like it was like this all along. We question assumptions of essential differences between men and women. Theorist Judith Butler, for example, has written a lot about how gender is actually a performance that we learn by seeing and doing it over and over again. That it's not a solid reality, it just feels solid because we perform it so many times. So we'll look at a text for the ways that these gender differences are codified and performed, or broken down. We explore whether there is an inherently female language or mode of writing, how that is constructed, how it helps to construct or deconstruct traditional modes of gender. And we'll incorporate authorial experiences sometimes, if they're relevant, to the understanding of the representation of gender within a text. Who are the people who are writing, and what are they doing? What are the tools they're using? Finally, we also try to make clear the ideological biases and bases of supposedly neutral or mainstream literary interpretations, like the liberal humanists, for example. They're not just reading the text without bias, right? They have a point of view based in a patriarchal world and based on assumptions that perpetuate that world. So a feminist reading is going to look at the ways in which this supposed neutral ends up breaking down and displaying its own bias. So that's your quick down and dirty introduction to feminist theory. We'll look forward to talking about it in class.